Good evening and welcome to the Armchair Monologues and the Problem of Being Awake. My name's Ben, I'll be your host. And this is a history of racism and bigotry. And the reason I'm making this video is because we are far more racially divided in the last 10 years than we've been for such a long time, going back a very long time. It's kind of like the trend of this generation Z actually having lower IQs, lower STEM scores, so science, technology, engineering, mathematics, lower literacy. Everything in this generation is going downhill for the first time ever, and with it, sort of racial division and hatred is climbing at a rate that's not in line with how it has been in the past. So these are two trends that really have been brought on by the far left and the radical arm of it, and its hold in academia in Western society, which is now well published. 90% of professors of all Western universities are quite left wing, and quite a large percent of them are quite radically left wing, and they have Marxist ideologies and socialist ideologies, and you can't apply them in democracies, which is why there's so much tension. But the race baiting of today is needless if you understand the history of what's going on, but it's ever present because people are stoking it. One would be Robin DiAngelo, who wrote the book White Fragility. I'm going to come on to that, but every single premise in that book is fundamentally flawed and based in nothing but her own opinion. It's been looked at by so many people with doctorates in behavioral science, and not one chapter, not one theory would be accepted as a premise for a doctoral thesis, which tells you that the book is an opinion. But people have made it their Bible. And has she caused more racial division in the United States by releasing that book of her opinions only? These aren't facts. There's no science to it. Just what she believes, and selling it so well and charging so much to do workshops now. She's like making absolute fortune off race. Has she added to the racial division? Yes, she has. Did she know that when she was writing her book? I would guess so, because otherwise she would have had it peer reviewed. She would have gone and she would have looked at it. She would have got a body of evidence together. She'd have alternate opinions. But in the book, it doesn't go that way. And, it would be rejected by any decent academia. But the time was right for it, and there's been lots of things that stoked racial division over the years, but it's really high right now. And the idea of making this video is a bit of a longer form chat where I could actually contextualize it a bit and just show how insanely bad it is that we allow certain bad actors, Robin DiAngelo being one of many, to kind of direct how we think and express ourselves in society, and therefore we have not the unity that we should when we have division. And I mean, the best current example of that is Donald Trump just recently got elected, but the propaganda against him was so large that almost half the country thought or still do think, he is Hitler incarnate and his supporters are Nazis. The other half of the country took the red pill, as it's called, started not believing the media and looking up news themselves and found the opposite was true. You could go, I've done video, but every hoax you've heard about Donald Trump, everything the Democrats said about him, they knew to be a lie when they were saying it. It was a deliberate malinformation campaign, which is where you take words from conversations and you clip them together to make one conversation that was never had. And you use that to propagate a lie. And that's what happened. And it divided America. Now, if we look back, one thing to definitely recognize is that racism is a form of bigotry. Now, bigotry has been around since way before language. So the 4,500 BC, I believe, is the origins of the Mesopotamian Empire, where they invented language. But they already had slavery and they had prostitution, and they had racism. So if you look at racism and bigotry, how would it exist if no one could talk about it? It didn't have a voice. And the answer is simple. Bigotry is reacting in a nasty way towards a group of people due to fear of the unknown. So that's a big part to really put in, fear of the unknown, because we don't have that excuse today. We don't. But let's just discuss how it all kind of started, and then we'll move forward to today. So before we go back to the beginning of it, it's worth noting there are 50 million people in slavery today as we speak. There were 12.5 million in the Atlantic slave trade in total. In fact, the African slave trade, black on black slave trade, does that in every 2 years. So every 4 years, it would be double the entirety of the Atlantic slave trade. And in fact, slavery has been prominent in Africa for longer than it's been prominent anywhere else in the world. Although it is a big problem in the Middle East and Asia as well. At the moment, there's 50 million people at the moment who are enslaved, and more every day. Some die, some get enslaved. It keeps happening. Now, if we go back, we all came from Africa. We all have black skin. And where bigotry comes in is when a tribe, because we formed tribes early on, with the onset of fire came the onset of tribes, because before fire there was nothing to do but hunt and gather in the daylight and hide in your cave at night from the beasts that were around you. But fire became not only a way of defending against the beasts, putting them off, but also a focus. And then suddenly people gathered by a fireside, and grunts started coming out in kind of the way they spoke, and more emphasis and grunts, and that was the first kind of beginnings of human communication. If you want an epidemiology experiment, go to a pub or somewhere which has a flickering, like slot machine, and just stand there with 3 or 4 people having a drink, and you'll find that your eyes dart towards the flickering light so much, and it's because it's inherently ingrained on us to gaze upon fire. So those flickering lights are very, very distracting to us, which is why if you video 4 people having a conversation where there isn't that, it's very different from when there is that. The conversation still flows, but the eyes go constantly to and from the machine. Now, fire was invented and grunting started to develop and pictures started to be drawn. And so the beginnings of language were pictures drawn by cavemen. Then we bumped into other tribes. And unfortunately, it's part of human nature. We did not recognize them or their weapons, let's say, or quite the look of them. And we just formed our first ever tribe. Well, it was a kind of us or them situation in our primitive, still very ape-like minds. Bearing in mind, we don't have language at this point. So we nearly killed the human race in Africa when everyone had black skin because of bigotry and racism. Fear and hatred of the unknown is that definition of bigotry. Racism, that redefines itself far too often, because it used to mean which country you were from, and now it's skin colour, and that's a big shift. Because in fact, the importance of skin colour is only out of the people who left Africa and how far they moved away from the equator. That determines people's skin colour. But it's estimated 13,000 people left Africa, and some stayed. Less than 13,000, but some stayed. So then we fast forward, we've got the Mesopotamian Empire. And here is the first time where they started to develop words, only single words. And then they would draw pictures to help explain those words. So you can already see the human mind shifting to suddenly linking a word one syllable word to a picture. And then maybe you would use a different tonality and draw another picture. And suddenly you have the beginnings of a conversation. And believe it or not, with the right interpretation, you can kind of get by with one word and a picture to describe what you're talking about. And the other person will agree enthusiastically and they'll do their own thing. And from there, language was invented. And we fast forward to the Greek Empire. We've got Socrates, Aristotle, and you'd argue that's where language was almost perfected. It was seen as a gift from God. It was seen as the best weapon there was. The Greek Empire really was the first of many empires to really encompass the use of the language to affect emotions and affect different responses in people. There are other civilizations that had language at times before that, but it wasn't used in the same way. See, the Chinese and the Japanese were probably the first civilized empires, or not specifically empires at that time, but civilized peoples. They had language, but if you look at the way they write, for example, you can see the kind of almost visualization of pictorial evidence there. So, their language they didn't have free-flowing prose until a couple of thousand years after they established civilization. They were very much developing their own language system at the same time. Prose really did come out from the great thinkers of the Greek Empire. And then it moved on, and we fast forward, we got the Roman Empire. And that was the beginnings of lots of things that were great for humanity, including, a great storage of food to allow food to be readily eaten and supplied, because they invented smokehouses, they invented food storage ways that no one had thought of. Sanitation, public sanitation, came into the Roman Empire. And obviously then people's life expectancy started to go up. And also women had a very different role in both the Greek and the Roman Empire, much more so in the Roman Empire. The woman was very well respected in relation to the husband. So it was the husband's job to do the work, but it was firmly the woman's job to run the home. And that there was a culture of, the man would say, we need to throw a party for 300 guests. And she would say, okay. And she would have the house staff to back up. This was assuming she's a noble person. Obviously, all the writings we have are of people who were mainly nobility in Rome. So the woman would then say, okay, then that's her job. Now, if the man tried to interfere with her planning that party, he would get a massive scolding, and society would have agreed with that. It wasn't his job. It wasn't seen as proper to do that. It was seen. So women had actually more respect in those times than they did end up coming into the medieval times, when probably, they had less. But still, we were all warring against each other because of a lack of understanding. And not one empire, not one legacy, not one civilization has ever not warred against another because of a lack of understanding and a difference in culture. And that brings us to today. Because, for example, we now have a Hispanic race. But Spain was a race and Portugal was a separate race at one point, but now we have a Hispanic race. And again, it's more skin pigmentation than it is any kind of actual real fear of skin colour. That came with the onset of the transatlantic slave trade. And it was a barbaric time. And, the Americans were the main traders, if you like, but the English and the Europeans were involved, and it was a bad time in history. We can all say that. I can't imagine being able to have somebody who belonged to me, let alone in chains, or let alone treat them badly. I just couldn't imagine that. I couldn't imagine having a servant. I might employ people, but that's different. But it's very hard to get into the mindset of that, that colonial time. And I'm going to say colonial, but the world is not built on colonies. If all land is stolen land, unless we've yet to discover it. If you think there's a place, well, maybe there's a couple, but if you think there's a mainstream place that wasn't taken over, then you'd have to be completely absent from history, or you're entirely wrong. Do you think Spain was originally belonged to the Spanish? No. Major parts of it actually belong to parts of the Arabic nation. And, we've had persecution, on Arabic tribes. We've had persecution of the Catholic Church on pretty much everybody. I think they really do win that one. As far as I know, the Jewish Empire was relatively small and not really pushed out. But I do have to say that Judea was founded by King David and Bethlehem was built by King Solomon. That was a long time before Muhammad was born. So we're going to talk about that being an apartheid land. You've got to scrap the idea because they built it roughly 900 years before Muhammad was born. So it can't be a Muslim land. Just a ridiculous argument, because where Judea is on the old map is exactly where Israel is now. And Bethlehem has always been Bethlehem. So moving forward with race, obviously, with slavery, there then came an uncomfortable period after slavery, where a lot of people had realised how badly the world had gone wrong. And that's why slavery was stopped, and thank God. But there was a difficult time in terms of integration, and that went on for a long time in America. Less in Europe, because there was less slavery, less slaves per person, less households had slaves. Overall, it was a smaller thing, so the integration was easier to manage, which is why you saw black people kind of making their own way in the world a little bit faster in Europe than they did in America. But it's key to remember that since the 1830s, there's been massive input into American culture from black people in terms of designing, in terms of inventing, in terms of art, in terms of being in Congress. The first black congressman was in like 1850. So it's not as if the world has only just come round to the idea that, everybody is equal. People wanted to come round, but you've got to also remember, if you turn around in the day of slavery, when every household of means was expected to keep slaves, and you took a moral high ground that was wrong, and you stood out on your own, there was no safety of democracy, there was no freedom of speech. If you made that kind of thing, you might be found guilty of heresy the next day. So you've got to give people their time. Like Shakespeare, he wrote what he wrote. He was a man of his time, a very wise man of his time. And if we look at who shaped the world, they were wise, intelligent people who wanted to make the world better. Now, they can't make it from pretty rubbish, which it was until about 1900 for almost everybody. No one was having a good time. If you go back 1,000 years, almost every populace, every race that we now recognise has been enslaved and oppressed. Every single one. Every country in Europe, all of Asia, everywhere. And still, the African slave trade market never stopped. Just the transatlantic stopped. But those people, they were not, it was not white people who enslaved black people. It was actually very wealthy black people who worked with white people to build a marketplace. And when the transatlantic slave trade stopped, the black on black slave enslavement of Africans didn't. And it hasn't. And it's probably one of the larger problems we should be tackling today, but we don't, because nobody wants to talk about it. Because it's much easier to think that the white man took the black man as a slave, and therefore the black man and the white man discussion as frictional and combative and race related and important to today is much more comfortable than recognising that also today in Africa there are still slave masters enslaving other Africans and selling them abroad. It's not a comfortable conversation for anybody. So let's move forward to today and see what we can cook up and maybe hopefully get some understanding. Now, if we look back at, I'm going to use America as a test model here, but racism is everywhere in America. It's everywhere in Europe. There's a huge crisis. A lot of it's to do with immigration, and a lot of it's to do with people stoking fear. And they have a vested interest in keeping people afraid. One thing to recognise about Black America is that Black people were more prosperous before the Equal Rights Act than they were afterwards, immediately. So they had 80% married households, and then by the mid-70s, that started to drop, and it's now at 20%, where there's a husband and a wife, or a couple even, raising a Black child in America. So something's disconnected there, because Black people, when equal rights weren't available, or when, there were still things like Black bathrooms and white bathrooms and no integration in schooling things, Black people actually did very well financially and became entrepreneurs. And there's hundreds of Black people from history in the last 150 years that have made notable changes and made fortunes for themselves. But you never get to hear these stories. Thomas Sowell is a fantastic economist, and he's a great thinker. He's probably he was part of Martin Luther King's movement. He didn't agree with everything he said, because a lot of what Martin Luther King was saying was Marxist and socialist, and he disagreed with that. And his books back that up. And I would recommend listening to his lectures on YouTube or watching his books about racism, because he thinks the same way. There's now God knows how many examples of every race succeeding to a high standard. Every race is represented in the top 1% around the world. So to say that the race is the barrier to success is complete fallacy. However, if you take Lyndon Baines Johnson and the Welfare Act that he passed, that was almost a slap in the face to the Equal Rights Act, because it basically then said that Black men and women are not really equal, and they need support from the government more than white people do. Now, if that support had been about integration and, sharing values, sharing everything, then that would have been great. But he actually had a different plan, which was to make it so that Black people needed to rely on the American government for money. And that plan still is in effect today in some ways. But you won't find, you can tell me that Black people in the ghetto are poorer than white people who aren't in the ghetto. Well, that's true, but if you go to something the opposite, and the phrase, and I don't like it in American, is trailer trash, which is the lowest class, working class. That in itself is the same kind of thing. That's a ghetto, and in there's many Black prosperous businessmen that are in a much higher class. Honestly, if you can't think of examples of great thinkers of all races, then you need to address why you only look at one thing rather than the whole picture. Because the whole picture is, since the 90s, every bit of research would show that period of the 90s was really good for integration of sexuality, in terms of, a reduction in misogyny and a reduction in racial division, which is not present today. The 90s was far less divided than we are today. Things came along. Gay rights came first. Then we had transsexual rights came quite early on. And people fought hard for those rights, and they won them. And there was a stigma at one point. And my godfather was gay. He had 2 children and got divorced, aged 50. But he was gay in a time when you couldn't be gay. But in the 90s, it was perfectly fine. And deep down, now people don't care about things like gay marriage or if they do that, they're a minority. Bigotry is a minority thing. Internally held belief, and racism, it has to be an internally held belief by an individual. It can't be attributed to a group or an inanimate object. It is a belief system. So would be misogyny. But everyone's pretty much had equal rights. There's far less supply than there is the demand for racism in society. Lots of people are stoking the idea that, the cultures are clashing. And the reason they're clashing is the left-wing won the culture war. Everybody did get equal rights, and then they thought they needed to go further and almost divorce themselves from reality. And you can see that now with the fact that people are butchering 10-year-olds to convincing them they're in the wrong gender. And I can tell you that scientifically, since it was declassified in 2019, having gender dysphoria went from being 0.004% to 1% as a bare minimum. That's impossible unless it's social and conditioned. So gender dysphoria only still affects 0.004% of people, but that's not the group that calls themselves trans. That's a much bigger amount of people. And inside that are some bad actors. And inside that are people making money off trans surgery, off people gender identity changes. People are making money off that, and they're making money off the racial divide. I highlight Robin DiAngelo because she started this idea of white privilege and white supremacy. Now, you look at me, I'm a 42-year-old straight white male. Obviously, I'm hugely privileged. Now, you can go back, my life story is on, I think, 2 videos of mine. But actually, if you look to my life, you go, God, that guy hasn't had a break in his life at all. I haven't experienced any privilege at all. From the age of 7, I mean, quite educated. I was expelled from 7 schools in 2 years. But I've had some serious bad sadism happen to me in a foreign country because of my skin colour. So I don't see a privilege. It's not a privilege to be white. It's not a privilege to be any particular colour. What you do with what you have is your privilege. It's your brain. It's your capacity to keep moving forward, making mistakes, falling over, moving forward, learning, growing, developing. And there had been incentives, and they still are there, that do keep sort of black families down in terms of it's quite expensive if you have a husband or a partner around, because government grants dry up at that point, and then you become a dual income house. That's affected black people in a way that now people are moving out of that model, but it has affected the way that black people have felt about society in America. And I'm strictly speaking about America here. We have our problems in Europe with Islamists. And I try to remind people that we had a lot of Muslim population 10, 15 years ago, and Islamists are different from Muslims. Islamists are fundamental followers of more the Hadith, so they are more prone to terrorism or terrorist sympathizing. But suddenly all of the white middle class kids in America and England and half of Europe are anti-Semitic and back the terrorists. I mean, universities turned Veterans Day into Martyrs Day so they could mourn the Hamas terrorists. What's gone on with this kind of division? So this conversation, I don't have the answer. I wish I did. I don't think any one person does. But it's important to know that there is an answer internally, and that is most people do not hold bigoted beliefs. Only a few do. And that will always be the case of every society throughout humankind moving forward forever. There will be bigots, and they aren't good people, and I would not personally associate with someone I knew to have bigoted views. I have had confrontations with people who have had bigoted views. I'm like that. I don't like having them expressed in public. But the bulk of people are just looking to connect on a human-to-human basis. And the biggest problem we have in this world now at the moment is technology, social media, and the fact that everyone is online rather than face-to-face connecting. But until we get past these ridiculous barriers that are the bigotry and the idea of systemic racism should be based on the fear of the unknown. But you can't logically now define that to be true because we have knowledge. And with knowledge, we have the power to act a certain way. And I firmly believe that if some of the bigger players, like George Soros, who's a white supremacist down to his core, he believes in him running the world and he thinks lowly of almost everybody. So he would be one of those people that there'll always be one or two in society. I'm not saying one or two, there's going to be more. But as a percentage wise, way less than 1% of people hold intensely bigoted or misogynistic views. And I'm sorry, as a psychologist, I can debunk the idea of unconscious bias, because the job of your unconscious or subconscious, as we say in England, is to bring your desires into your conscious awareness to act upon them. If someone was unconsciously racist, they would turn out to be consciously racist very quickly because their subconscious would keep pushing that to them until they gave in to it. So the idea that somebody's unconsciously racist is absolutely not psychologically possible, and implicitly racist, well, that's just ridiculous because, as I said, go back a few more generations and everyone was enslaved. My hope is that people can at least use some of this information to look at themselves and the people around them and ask, do you actually hang around with loads of racist and misogynist people? Or does the media portray that to you? And that's the real question. Because the media's been lying to us for years. Most of us have figured that out now. And the people who didn't probably got a very big kick up the arse when Donald Trump got elected, because the media was saying it wasn't possible because they were running a propaganda thing against him. But most of the country saw through it this time. So my hope is that people can look around and think, okay, yes, there are 17 different components to the gender pay gap. Let's look at them. Yes, there are multi-layered components to the idea of systemic racism. Let's look at them. Let's talk about them. Let's have a dialogue, because internally we desire just human connection and we don't care really where it comes from. But something in the culture at the moment is driving people towards division and hatred rather than inclusion. I don't mean DEI inclusion, because that's an evil mandate, DEI, but inclusion, tolerance, and the fresh and free thinking of ideas. And if we can get that going, we can debunk the idea of systemic racism, we can get rid of the idea of systemic misogyny, and we can move forward into a more enlightened way of thinking about the world and look back on the progress of the world as necessary and not to be deleted, but to be learnt from and to not be repeated where travesties were repeated. And with that, I'll leave it there. I really do enjoy these long form conversations. I enjoy unpacking things in more detail. You can't do that in a short video on YouTube, so it takes a bit longer. But thank you for listening. Always a pleasure, never a chore, and you be lucky, I'll be good, and I'll see you next time.